welcome to another episode of Pit Lane Parlay.
Welcome to another Lost Track edition of Pit Lane Parlay. My name is host Mike Jokum. Joining me to talk Trenton Speedway today, and I'm sure he'll be back to talk some of these other tracks here, is Frank Santoroski. Frank, thanks for joining me tonight, man.
Oh, hey, Mike, anytime, and I appreciate the offer.
Yeah, great to have you on. For those who don't know, Frank has a great motorsports podcast called Drafting the Circuits. You may have heard me on there at some point earlier this year or last year, but today we're here to talk Trenton Speedway, which is or it used to be about 10 miles from where I grew up, right in Trenton, New Jersey. So Frank, where do we start when we talk about Trenton Speedway?
Well, Trenton Speedway is actually one of the oldest tracks on the planet, the oldest oval tracks. A lot of your early oval tracks in the United States began as horse racing facilities. Now, Trenton, just to set the scene here, Trenton, if you're not familiar with New Jersey, Trenton is in kind of central west New Jersey. It's about half an hour from Philadelphia, a little over an hour from New York City. So it's between some big population centers, and New Jersey has a large population of its own, with Trenton being a pretty well-populated city. It's the capital of New Jersey. The track was put together in 1900, again, basically for horse racing. But in that same year they built the track, they did have their first auto race, which was more of a kind of a curiosity. The automobile was still very new. A lot of people had never seen one in their life. So this was more of like, get your first look at the amazing new horseless carriage. But that was the first motorsports event at Trenton in 1900. But the racing really kind of didn't catch on there till about 1912. I mean, they used it for horse racing. They had a couple of races here and there between 1905 and 1908. But in 1912, they started hosting auto racing regularly. Now, Trenton is part of the New Jersey State Fairgrounds, and auto racing at the State Fair all across the country became pretty much the rage in the early 1910s and whatnot. So they continued on racing. It was a half-mile dirt oval. They ended up building grandstands there, and raced, during the State Fair, and then on occasional weekends here and there through the year until 1941, when, with World War II, auto racing was banned across the United States, as every manufacturer was
right
to put their efforts towards the war effort. So, like every other track in the United States, it sat dormant until 1946, and they reopened the track, and they expanded the half-mile oval to a 1 mile oval. Now, the interesting thing they did here was they moved the track a little bit. They changed the profile of a track to get that 1 mile oval in there, but they didn't move the grandstands because there's a concrete foundation under the grandstands. It was pretty easy to move the track, a little harder to move the grandstands. So you had this really odd viewing angle in the turn 1 to 2 area, where the spectators were rather far from the track, and the profile of the new track didn't match the profile of the old track, but the grandstand matched the profile of the old track that was not there. But folks got used to it, and as racing kind of picked up there, 1949 was the first time we saw the Indy cars, which were called the championship cars then. They raced on the dirt there. It didn't come back. They were, transitioned more and more to pavement, but there were a lot of, kind of modified races and, run what you brung kind of things. But in 1957, I believe,
Yep.
they went ahead and paved the track, and which brought the champ cars back for good. And the champ cars raced at least twice a year in some years 3 times a year, all the way until the track closed in 1980. The last races there were in 1979. In that stretch of having the champ cars, we saw a lot of great races, and again, sometimes 2 times a year, sometimes 3 times a year. But the master of Trenton was a young man named AJ Foyt, and I know that some of you folks that enjoy IndyCar racing have heard of him. But
never heard of him before.
Never heard of him, yeah. So, but he was the king of Trenton, and then this other young fella who didn't live that far away was the Prince of Trenton, Mario Andretti, who also won. I believe Mario won 7 races at Trenton, and AJ won 12. So those guys really had it figured out. So we continued on the paved 1 mile oval for a decade until they wanted to expand this thing to what you call super speedway length, which was 1.5 miles. Now, the confines of the real estate, there's a housing development over on the other side of the track, so they couldn't just kind of, just expand the thing in a straight line. So they essentially bent the track and give it this kidney bean shape. So there's a dog leg on the backstretch, right? But it's not a dog leg in the traditional sense. The dog leg is inverted, so you've got an oval with a pronounced right turn that was made it a little interesting for guys to set up. But the guys who had figured out the old track figured out the new track. Again, we're talking Mario and we're talking AJ. So that track continued on until the demise, and we can talk about that in a little bit. But I don't want to do all the talking. I want to see what kind of things you want to throw at me.
Yeah, no, it's funny you mentioned the for lack of a better term here, the kidney bean shape that started in 1969 that you were just talking about.
68
which appeared in that Indy 500 historical-ish video game that was on the original Xbox a number of years ago. It was considered pretty dangerous, if I'm not mistaken, correct, for the guys who didn't figure it out?
Well, the thing was, excuse me, all racing was dangerous then. Trenton was no more or less dangerous than other tracks. As a matter of fact, there's only 3 deaths for the IndyCar guys that happened at Trenton, and one of them is a very interesting story. Jimmy Reese died there in 1958, and that was prior to the kidney bean shape. But Jimmy Reese had been involved in an accident earlier that year at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, the accident that took the life of Pat O'Connor. Now, another driver named Ed Elysian was widely blamed for this accident. However, Jimmy Reese felt a little at fault, and when it came down to it, when his car was slipping away with the melee in front of him, he kind of braked really hard, which collected up some guys behind him. Now, when Reese had his accident at Trenton, when his car was getting away, he didn't brake or didn't slow. He kind of kept his foot in it, which launched him over the fence and cost him his life. Now, some folks say that he was, had learned that lesson, didn't want to collect other guys behind him, but we'll never be able to ask him because he lost his life in the crash. But that's kind of an odd little undertone story there. But as far as was the kidney bean shape dangerous? It was no more dangerous than other tracks when it comes to. I mean, sure, there were some wrecks there for guys that couldn't figure it out. But I mean, if you look at the stats and look at the speeds of Trenton, not a lot of guys. I mean, when you compare it to a place like Langhorne, which would chew up guys and spit them out, or even if you compare it to the Indianapolis Speedway, which would lose guys left and right, and sometimes 2 and 3 guys in the same race meeting, Trenton was no more dangerous than anywhere else. But it was interesting. It was different. It was hard to set your car up for, because this is in a time where the guys were running primarily ovals all the time, so they put a lot of stagger in the tires to make it turn left really well. But Trenton had it wasn't just a little right turn. It was a straight up right turn in the middle of that back straightaway. So
Yeah, the old video and pictures I've been able to find of it are pretty remarkable. And you touched on AJ Foyt, and I'm looking at the winners list here. He won 5 times in a row between April 1963 and July 19th of 1964 at Trenton. And for those listening, I'll post these pictures on our social media after the episode is released. My great-grandfather got a picture of Eddie Sachs in Victory Lane in the early 1960s. I have a Foyt picture from 1963 in Victory Lane. Some real cool old photos from Trenton. And yes, we will definitely talk Langhorne in the upcoming weeks as the other even more local track to to me here. So, talking more about Trenton, in addition to the kidney bean, one of the turns from Pocono was modeled after Trenton, if I'm not mistaken, correct?
Yes, that's correct. The turns at Pocono are modeled after Milwaukee, Indianapolis, and Trenton. Turn 1 is Trenton, turn 2 is Indianapolis, and turn 3 is Milwaukee. But it's interesting that you bring up Pocono, because Pocono was actually Pocono was built in 1971, but Pocono had a little bit to do with the demise of Trenton, based on they're about an hour apart. Trenton actually did host NASCAR. They only hosted them 8 times, I believe. I don't. Number one, they didn't draw a crowd. Folks preferred the open wheel cars to the stock cars. Stock cars really didn't catch on nationwide till much later. But once Pocono was up and running, the NASCAR guys, which the Cup Series now was called the Grand National Series then, decided to move their date that they had reserved for Trenton to Pocono. The last NASCAR race was in 1972 at Trenton, and in 1974 they debuted at Pocono, and they've been having quite good success at Pocono ever since.
Did the NASCARs, I was going to call them the Grand Nationals, did the NASCARs have any different struggle with the kidney bean shape than the IndyCars did?
They had a very similar struggle, because again, you're talking guys that are running primarily ovals. Other than the occasional trip to Riverside, where they could set up a car for a road course, but here you are, you want to set up for an oval because 75% of this track is an oval. It's just that one turn in there. So the struggles were similar with the setup. So. But speaking of the danger of the track, I wanted to, before we got too far off the subject of the danger of the track, I wanted to bring up a guy named Tommy Thompson. Now, does that name ring a bell to you at all?
Only because I see his name on the front of my computer screen right now, looking at Trenton Speedway facts. But to be honest with you, outside of that, no, it does not ring a bell.
So interestingly enough, here's a guy who was kind of lost to racing. He was an African-American driver, and he was a very talented young man. He was running in the USAC Mini Indy Series, which is the precursor to Indy Lights, but it was really closer to Formula Super V back then. It was 1978, where Tommy had a pretty promising career. He was running in open wheels, also running in NASCAR, but he lost his life at Trenton in 1978. In the mini Indy race, the opening act.
Right.
So that's the word I'm looking for, the opening act for the big USAC race that was won by Mario the next day. But here's a guy who could have realistically beat Willie T. Ribbs to the mantle of the first African-American to qualify for the Indy 500, because this guy was pretty good. He was working on a shoestring budget, but he had some decent backers. So that was a little tragic in the what could have been kind of scenario there coming out of Trenton.
Yeah, now that you talk about him, I definitely have heard my dad talk about him in the past. Real quick, not necessarily a Trenton question, but because you brought it up, how did the mini Indy cars differ from the Super V cars? For Frank, in case you didn't listen or any of our listeners forgot, back in May we talked to now former NHL goalie Mike McKenna, whose dad was a Super V driver back in the 60s or 70s. I'm sorry, Mike, I'll have to check with you on when he raced.
If I'm not mistaken, the Mini Indy and the SCCA Formula Super V were pretty much the same formula. It just, they were sanctioned by different bodies there. You had the USAC Mini Indy, but it was essentially the same thing as the Formula Super V. And there are a lot of really good IndyCar racers who came up through Super V. Michael Andretti, Bill Alsop, Rick Mears, names like that. And I think they just, the USAC, the ones sanctioned by USAC were called Mini Indy. Then the SCCA had their Formula Super V, and then they later had gotten Robert Bosch company to sponsor the series in the SCCA when CART kind of took over from USAC as the primary sanctioning body for the Indy cars. But I don't believe there's a whole lot of difference, and I'm sure there's a couple of old timers out there who will correct me and tell me I'm totally wrong and tell me that the specs were wrong. But as far as I know, the Mini Indies were very similar to the Super Vs.
All right, so let's we'll wrap up our Trenton Speedway edition here with the what led to the demise of Trenton Speedway. I know you mentioned kind of what led to the demise from the NASCAR perspective. But what led it to now become a UPS shipping facility and a cramped housing development in Trenton, New Jersey?
Well, there's a lot of contributing factors there. If you look at the fate of, say, Riverside and Ontario out in California, it's very similar to what happened to Trenton as urban sprawl kind of moved in. And again, Trenton is sandwiched between New York City and Philadelphia. The real estate values were much higher for redevelopment than they are to have a racetrack that would sit there dormant for most of the year until the state fair came around. Pocono played a part in the demise. We had it sounds weird to say Pocono was an ultra modern facility compared to Trenton. I mean, to say that today with, where Pocono was kind of knocked as being a little behind the times, but, back in the early 70s. And, once Pocono opened their doors, the USAC was there right away. And so you've got the kind of geographical area covered with fans. So the crowd started to dwindle at Trenton. The other contributing factor was they were looking to move the state fair from Trenton to Sussex County, which happened in, I want to say, 1983, which was about 2 years after the track closed. But they went ahead and sold the track and the entirety of the state fairgrounds to private developers. A few other things that factored into this, in 1976, when you figure it's a state fairgrounds, there's state money coming into there, right? In 1976, there's a lot of state money that went in to build Giant Stadium to attract both the New York Giants and the New York Jets to play in New Jersey up in the Meadowlands. Then in 1980, they built the basketball stadium there to attract the New Jersey Nets and the New Jersey Devils. So you've got state money that's being funneled up that way, farther up north, and so there's a little less going into Trenton. That combined with the real estate prices going up to where it's more lucrative just to sell it, the state money and the dwindling crowds all kind of get a part in there. So a lot of folks will tell you that there is nothing you can see that will tell you a speedway used to be there, but there are a few things you can look at. If you go to next to the UPS facility, there's a nice little, it's like a meditation garden. It's called the Grounds for Sculpture. There's a lot of sculpture, a lot of greenery and plants and whatnot. It's just a nice little place, but there's a little part in the middle, and it's the sculpture court. Now, when they pulled the grandstands out, still, we're talking about this concrete foundation that they wouldn't pull out when they moved the track in the 50s. So they still didn't pull that concrete foundation out. So they built the grounds for sculpture, the sculpture court, right over the top of the concrete foundation. So the footprint of the sculpture court is the contour of the grandstands from Trenton. Other than that, there's not a lot you can see. Some folks tell me there's a street in a suburb that used to be the front straightaway. I mean, it's been paved over so many times and whatnot. It's not the same width. I really don't see that you can see that there, but the sculpture court still has the contour of the original grandstand there. So if you can kind of visualize it when you see, if you could stand in there, ignore all the sculptures and imagine a racetrack being there, you can maybe feel it. But otherwise, it's there's nothing left. Urban development. There's a nice housing facility, a big UPS thing. I went to the last IndyCar races at Trenton, and those were in 1979 when the kart series had 3 races that year. I went to the doubleheader event in June. Bobby Unser won both of those. At the time I was there, the facilities were, obviously suffering from some lack of upkeep and whatnot, and that all factors into a lot of that state money being funneled up to the Meadowlands for football, basketball, and hockey, which was drawing more folks than racing. So, but again, Trenton has left an indelible mark on racing. And if you were to sit and talk with Mario, or sit and talk with AJ, or sit and talk with other guys that have won there, like Gordon Johncock and even Bobby Unser, Rick Mears won the final race at Trenton. They'll all have fond memories.
Yeah, I've got a picture from AJ's last win there hanging on my wall here in the office. It's such a cool track to talk about. Frank, thanks very much for the history lesson on Trenton here. I think we'll talk Langhorne next in the near future here, but I hope everybody appreciated this and enjoyed the Nazareth Speedway edition as well. And we'll be back with more of these throughout the off season. Thanks very much, Frank.
Oh, thank you. Appreciate you having me on.
No problem, man.